Let's go back to where we were. I've got this upside down. Okay. Now, we're in some very hard stuff here, and I'm going to go sort of slowly and try to get us oriented so that we can sort of go faster next week. But we've got another 2 lectures on this chapter, and we'll need them. What's hard about it, and this is what I ended up saying last time, is that it starts out fine with lots of interesting phenomenology, and it's typical of Merleau-Ponty that he likes the descriptions that Husserl has, that Hurler and Kafka and the Gestaltists have, and he likes the descriptions of the weird pathological phenomena in Schneider that Gelb and Goldstein give. And I think he also likes, though this is sort of more vague, the criticism that they have of other people's ways of understanding the phenomena. But then in the case of all 3 of these guys, he doesn't like their analysis of what's going on, what explains all these phenomena that they're describing. And of course it always turns out to be that they are still too much trapped into some kind of empiricist or intellectualist issue, way of looking at things. In Husserl it's too intellectualist, in the Gestaltists it's too empiricist and naturalist, and in Goldstein it's, I guess, both. They're the worst of both worlds, but they're also the most interesting because they've got such an interesting phenomena to study in Schneider. Now, and the only way to keep track of what's going on is to always really ask yourself, what's he agreeing with as he's doing this? And this is what's so hard in the Goldstein stuff we're going to do today. And what is he saying is wrong with it? And at least you can keep that is your kind of beacon. I'll keep telling you this. I mean, it's always the conclusion's going to be they don't have being in the world. They can't understand the phenomena they're talking about because there's a more fundamental phenomena that they don't know anything about, that only Merleau-Ponty and somebody whose name is hardly ever mentioned, Heidegger, knows something about. And you'll see it again today. What struck me today, at one point I decided I really promised to tell you how much of this is not a Merleau-Ponty, but is pure Goldstein. So I started looking through the book to see sort of where Merleau-Ponty leaves off and starts describing the Goldstein case, and that's on page 122. And then I kept looking and looking and looking and looking, where does he finally stop expounding Goldstein and explaining it from his perspective? Well, on page 140. That's almost 18 pages of what you're reading is not what he thinks. However, it's a valuable step toward what he thinks, because it, 1, shows sort of phenomena that you've got to take account of, and 2, shows how you can't take account of it unless you've got being in the world. So that's going to keep him busy for 18 pages. Okay, let's go back in the light of what I just said, and in general trying to make sense of him, to any old place where he says being in the world. Those are the magic words that mean, now I'm going to tell it to you my way. And so one of the places right near the beginning that we ended with last time, or was near the end anyway, is the bottom of 115, which is, remember that there's the zone of not being in front of which figures stand out and so forth. In the last analysis, that's really just the last analysis here, if my body can be a form, if there can be in front of it important figures against indifferent backgrounds, which is all that the Gestaltists see, and it's great that they see it, this occurs in virtue of its being polarized by its tasks, by its existence toward them, of its collecting itself in the pursuit of its aims. Now remember, all that is always the involved story. I mean, the thing that he says the Gestaltists don't have is always the pursuit of its aims. the movement, what I keep saying, the movement toward optimal grip. The fact that there is something, that it isn't just the way the visual system works that you have to study, but the way this whole organism works, geared into the whole world. That's so all those phrases are important. The polarization of its tasks into the world, existence towards them, that is, in a way, existence in the tasks or whatever they're doing, and it's collecting itself in pursuit of its aims. So the body schema, and you've got to remember always schema, is finally a way of stating that my body is in the world. And then again, of course, one's own body is a third term, always tacitly understood in the figure ground structure. It's behind, so there's a deeper ground behind the figure ground structure, he's telling you. And it's called being in the world. I wanted to stop for a second. That was all review. Maybe I should go on with the review and then stop for a second. And this special kind of background is also what he calls bodily space. And bodily space is got these three, I think I said this, but I can say it again, three unique characteristics. I just said the first. It's the background for ordinary figure ground experience. It can never be made into a figure without transforming it into something else, because when it's doing its job, it's never present, but is always the darkness in the theater in which you can see the spectacle, the non-being, in terms of which all beings can be experienced, and so forth. And that void, to quote that other place, on the bottom of 117, these are such important quotes to keep as beacons as you go into the murky next part. At the new paragraph on 117, if bodily space and external space form a practical system, the first being of the background against which the object is a goal that may stand out, or now the void in front of which it may come to light, it is clearly an action that the spatiality of our body is brought into being, and an analysis of one's own movement to enable one to arrive at a better understanding of it. And that's what he's going to turn to now. So the third characteristic of it is that this void isn't just any old void or any old non-being, but it's a non-being that's tied into your involvement. That's what I was just saying. Okay. I wanted to say, too, now, sort of getting something straight. I wasn't very clear last time, and it didn't bother anything I said. There's motility chapter here is about our movement. And then there is a later chapter which is going to be about motion, about how we experience the motion of objects. And that's another whole subject, and they shouldn't be mixed up together. Unfortunately, I haven't gone back to look at the French. I don't know. Is Olivier here? Does the French help? How can we go on without Olivier? I was going to ask him, does the French have a distinction between movement and motion? The German does have it, Bewegung and Bewegtheit, but I don't know, I can't think of any French that makes that distinction. That makes it harder to see what the two issues that are so separate. But I guess our English translation has it in terms of, we could look at the French and see what's the name of this chapter, which gets called motility.
Put in the table of contents.
It should be in the table of contents. What? No, I mean, in the French, what are they translating as motility? So we can find out. So here we are. Spatiality du corps propre et la motricité. Okay, it looks like motricité is going to be his word, the French word for body movement. We don't have it terribly clear in English. You could talk about the movement of the heavenly bodies, but you really ought to talk about the motion of the planets, I think. Anyway, so then later there's going to be a lot of talk about the experience of the motion of other things. I'm not even going to try to find out where that is. I just want to keep it straight that there are these two different issues and keep clear which one we're at. That's no problem. I just wasn't focusing on it last time. Now, another thing that is not a main problem, but in office hours, I was asked a sort of interesting question about that why are we calling this body, which is the body schema, which is our general way of having a world, which we share with everybody else, which accounts for why we see the same colors and the same constancies and brightness and shapes and space and time as everybody else, and which he talks about later. I don't think we've seen it yet, the way one experiences in me. Then that's just another way of saying that what the body schema is what we've all got. It's in sort of more contemporary and more neural jargon, it's the perceptual system. The perceptual system isn't yours or mine, and the body schema, which is the way the perceptual system actually gets lived, isn't yours or mine. So why does he keep talking about my own body? He ought to say one's own body, or maybe nobody's own body. I mean, it should be just the body. And the answer is he shouldn't. And he doesn't. That's an artifact of the translation of it into English. In French, it's le corps propre, and that means something like, well, the body as it really is. And that's fine. I mean, that's really the right thing to say. That's neutral. That's supposed to distinguish the body as it really is from the body as an object to be studied by as an object in the universe. It distinguishes it also, I think, the body from when I'm moving it, which is not what interests him, where I have an intentional action and then that governs and causes a bodily movement. That's not le corps propre. The corps propre is the body as it is, sort of at its best, or something like that. It's the body in its everyday, transparent coping, directed toward a goal, of course. Okay, I just wanted to say that because it never occurred to me before that translation is misleading. But you should always bear in mind that he's not talking about your experience of your body, but something that, for one thing, nobody needs to experience, because the body schema goes on doing all the things it's doing, whether you experience it or not. And most of the time you don't. I mean, you don't have to experience how it keeps the brightness constant and the colors constant as the illumination shifts and so forth. The body schema can take care of that without any help from your conscious ego. Is that clear? I think that's important. You've got to be clear that the level on which he's talking, which is impersonal, transparent coping, period. And the way we've come across it so far is we're calling it the body schema. Any questions about that? It's not news, but it's hard to get used to if the translation sort of pushes you in some other direction, where you think, for instance, trying to feel what it's like to have a body, get your kinesthetic sensations in front of you, or try to feel what it is like to have proprioception and so forth. That's what you shouldn't be doing, because I keep saying this to me too, but I've finally gotten used to it. When the body schema is operating at its best, it's not being experienced by anybody, and it's just doing what the general perceptual system does. Okay, that maybe is meant to be provocative. Okay, go ahead.
Well, just a simple question. How does phenomenology, which is carried out in the first person by reflection, not reflection, we don't like the word, but by consideration of one's own case, relate?
Okay, good.
How can that possibly be a source of knowledge about this mind-independent thing in itself?
This came out in office hours too, in an interesting way. I was asked the question. Where's Agnes here, who was the one who did all the asking of these good questions? Anyway, the answer's got to be that Merleau-Ponty does it mostly by talking about breakdown cases. That's why there's all this pathology is in all around. You can see it by seeing what it would be like not to have it. And that's what he's going to do. All this talk of Schneider is an illustration that it all points towards something that Schneider has but he's not aware of and we're not aware of, namely being in the world. But when you don't have it, look what a mess you're in. That's the first thing to say. But the second thing to say is, and notice he's doing this breakdown business even in the simple case of the ship and the masts and the trees, which we saw. When you want to slow down the microseconds that it takes you to take in a new scene, which you don't just automatically take in. You've got to organize it, and the Gestaltists know that, and Walter Freeman can measure how long it takes. But Merleau-Ponty can't tell you, go look at it, because you're in a familiar world in which you're so, and you come from a place where it's already organized into a place where it's going on just as you expected. But he'll give you a breakdown case to slow it down. Or the other breakdown case we talked about in a museum facing a new kind of painting, presumably. You have to let your body push you around for a while so you get to the right distance to see it. You can't count on your normal distance to see the thing on the wall as a normal object, and so it slows down that. But now there's a big problem behind that, which you probably would ask next if I let you, which is, how do you know that these breakdown cases point to something else that you're not experiencing, which is really the basis of them? Well, one way, and that's why I mentioned the trees and the masts, is some of these breakdown cases, it's a matter of degree, which is nice. I mean, you can sort of find intermediate cases to talk like Wittgenstein, from the masked boat case to the case in the museum to the case where you just turn and there everything is where you expect it to be. And if you lay out all these intermediate cases, you can then feel convinced that the breakdown case is not revealing something else that goes on when there's something wrong. That's how the masked one works. It's different with Goldstein. His breakdown case is definitely revealing something that isn't there normally at all. See, there are two different kinds of breakdown. And that case, you can't say, you want to sort of gradually find that somebody is badly damaged. But you can do two things, I think. One, you can just use it to point to something that's missing, which is how he's using it. You can also do it better and better. Schneider is such a mess because he's got too many things wrong with him. I mean, then you get somebody like D.F. that Milner and Goodale write about, and we've got a paper on the virtual reader by Sean Kelly about, where you get just separated out a piece of the pathology. And then you can then now, more and more, you get them separated out. And then you can see each one. I'm going to get back to another wonderful one, utilization behavior, as an example of this. You can use pathologies to show sort of isolatable capacities by showing isolable lack of them, and instead of sort of global. But anyway, that's not, I don't think there's any simple answer, except this. Phenomenology is not introspection, the more I was sort. Phenomenology is not consulting your ordinary everyday experience, because in your ordinary everyday experience at its best, your body schema is doing fine, and you've got no access to it. It's just so mistaken to think that the phenomenology has anything to do with introspection, reflection, meditation, and all that. Merleau-Ponty is not trying to tell you what stands to get in to see what he's talking about. He's got to do it in this much more roundabout way. It's always about breakdown. Yeah.
I'm not so sure about that. For example, if Merleau self-esteem leads me to look not in people's eyes but in people's shoes, then isn't this a way of a successive mode of experience?
Wait, it's my trouble. I don't hear very well anymore. You have to talk louder. I didn't quite get it. Just say it again loud.
If I'm not comfortable looking in people's eyes, but I'm just staring at the floor
okay.
and speaking to them, isn't that a mode of subjective way of experiencing the world, my own being in the world?
Well, I guess I've got several things to say. One, if it was, it wouldn't be interesting to Merleau-Ponty. It would be too, I don't know what Ontic Heidegger would say. It would be too specific, and he's interested in the general structures we share with everybody. But I think the more interesting thing to say with you is that you wouldn't normally be aware of that. It's transparent. And now, and if you become aware of it, I bet he would say, it's as if you were viewing yourself as an outsider would view you. Yet you can do that. But insofar as you're just engaged in doing it, I think he would say it is invisible to you that you're doing it. Once you've got your attention sort of called to it, you can catch yourself doing it. But I don't see that that's got, surely all of phenomenology isn't like that, catching you doing some specifically individual kind of thing and then making you notice it. I don't think. I mean, why should it? I mean, it's got to be general. It's not about you and me. It's about the corpora. It's about the body schema. It's about the perceptual system. And if it's true that the perceptual system operates at its best when it's operating invisibly, then calling your attention to it has got to be very tricky. You can't just reflect on it.
Well, what I was pointing at is that I feel like the ostentation of my own body, because it is, I can, even though I'm not explicit about it, I would never be able to get out of it. So I will always experience things from my own body, from my own attitude.
Yeah, but what you're not experiencing, I'm not sure we're having any disagreement. That's fine, but what you're not experiencing is anything uniquely yours. You're experiencing what anybody could. Merleau-Ponty is interested in this only at a level at which if everybody were not looking in people's eyes but looking at their shoes, and if that was some kind of structure of human beings, then he'd be interested. But otherwise, that's nice, and somebody could write a kind of, like Sartre writes about in La Nausée, you could write about, well, that's an interesting example. La Nausée is a kind of, in Sartre's book, nausea is a kind of phenomenology of a particular person with a particular psychosis. It's interesting because it happens to be a psychosis he thinks which reveals the world as it really is. But it's too specific. It's for Heidegger, it's existentiel and not existential. For Husserl, it hasn't made the eidetic reduction. It's phenomenology is biography. And there was a whole school, I can't help telling you. I think the guy who runs it is dead now, I'm pretty sure, which is just, I don't mean just as well in the sense that he wasn't a nice guy, but I think he was doing a lot of harm because he had this summer school in phenomenology, and what it meant was you go to St. Louis, where he was, and you spend your time going around trying to describe exactly how this kind of bridge looks to you on a rainy day or something. I mean, that's not introspection exactly, but it's certainly not phenomenology. Because phenomenologists aren't interested in how that bridge looks to you on a rainy day. They are interested in how bridges manage to look as if they have the same size and the same form as you walk around, as anybody walks around any bridge. And I'm amazed that I'm spending so much time talking about this. I would have thought this was absolutely obvious, but since it isn't, I will go on. Yeah.
I thought a very different question. You started off today by reading the quote on page 150, which suggested the God-directedness of the body schema. But later on, you said the body schema is the same for everybody else, and you associate it with the perceptual system. So, where is this dynamic part of the schema, this path-directedness?
Good. Let's see, two pieces to that. One, of course, everybody's directed to their own goal, and everybody sees the world from their own perspective. But he's just abstracting from that and saying it doesn't matter which goal, but it's always attempt to. It isn't a question of whether you're trying to get a maximal grip on the mass and the trees, or the picture in the museum, or just the people in front, or me if you're looking up here. That's one thing. So sure, it's always goal-directed. It's always trying to get a grip. That's one story. And the other one, what was the second one? Oh, yeah, and the depends on how you view the perceptual system, of course, and I should say something about that. From the Gestaltist point of view, there is already this anonymous perceptual system doing the stabilizing and organizing of experience, and in that way, the Gestaltists have got onto something very important and half right. It's anonymous and it organizes the perceptual world, and half wrong because they haven't taken into account that the perceptual system itself only works when it's integrated into a world in which it's already pursuing significance. It's the Walter Freeman objection. It's what Walter Freeman says against all neuroscience. They just sort of think they can study what goes on in the brain without asking what the organism is doing in the world, and you can't. And the Gestaltists are making the same mistake. They think, oh boy, if we could only find the fields in the brain that underlie the perceptual balances and equilibrium in the perceptual field, we'll understand something. And Merleau-Ponty is not saying you never found it, ha ha, which is what everybody else said. He was saying even if you had found it, it wouldn't mean anything if it weren't correlated with goals. And, okay, but I'm glad I think you knew that already, but you wanted me to say it. So there, I think I said it. Okay, let's go back. I mean, that's all good review, but now we're going to go to the breakdown case on 117 that lacks being in the world and see what that looks like. And we're going to see it by way of seeing the sort of the best Gestalt neuroscientists dealing with this interesting case of the guy called a patient at the top of 118, who was later called Schneider. Just occurred to me, absolutely for what it's worth, Schneider can't be his real name, but it's funny that they named him Schneider because that in German means cutter, and he cuts these wallets. I suppose that's no accident. By the way, Schneider was a good friend of Gurvich's. Remember I mentioned Gurvich. Gurvich used to walk Schneider home after Gelb and Goldstein had been studying for him for a while. So since I shook hands with Gurvich and he's a buddy of Schneider's, you are buddies of Schneider's at second hand, if that makes you feel any more interested in his weird case. I never asked Gurvich about him at all. I feel now I wish I had him. It would have been fun to hear more. But we hear plenty about his world. Okay, let's go now to the whole story of Schneider. Let's see where I am. So the important thing to bear in mind through it all, and this is where I was at the end last time, is that the way Gelb and Goldstein are going to analyze Schneider is in terms of their basic categories, which are the abstract attitude and the concrete attitude. And we'll see in more detail in a minute what that means, but roughly that means there's this involved coping attitude, and there's a detached attitude in which you can step back from your involvement in your coping and describe everything, including your own body. And they think that roughly, I think they think, I was trying to figure that out for sure. As you read it, see if this is true. They think that Schneider's got the concrete attitude, but he lacks the abstract attitude. And Merleau-Ponty thinks Schneider hasn't got either one because one, he lacks something that without which you couldn't have either of them, and secondly, he hasn't got either one because there are no such things. They're abstractions, the concrete and abstract attitude, from being in the world, there's. I can't resist saying this now because I might forget later. What the concrete attitude would look like, if there really were such a thing, is something that Eric has showed me neuroscience of, that Merleau-Ponty didn't know, or I think he would have found it fascinating. What would it be to be in a concrete attitude in which you are, and all, I will get to it, but the concrete attitude is maybe we should read it. Here on page 122. And it is Schneider. And it is, I think, what they think we all have. So he's cutting these wallets and sewing them together, and then about 10 lines down, the body is no more than an element in a system of the subject and his world. The tasks to be performed elicit the necessary movement from him by a sort of remote attraction. Well, that's sounding sort of close to right. I mean, I say things like that all the time when I'm trying to explain how we respond to affordances. And I think I may have already said how it's in Homer. Did I mention Homer already, my favorite example? I did. Okay, yeah, that's like their arms going out to the food in front of them. Schneider is just like the hungry Homeric heroes. So there's a remote attraction as the phenomenal forces at work in the visual field elicit from me without any calculation on my part the motor reactions that establish the most effective balance between them, and so forth. That's a good Gestaltist account of Schneider and the affordances. But and if you had that and no abstract attitude, just pure Schneider response to affordances, pure concrete attitude, how would it look? Well, I had no idea till Eric showed me this pathology, something called utilization behavior. People who have a certain brain damage are so pulled in by affordances that they take up whatever is around that is sort of saliently affords doing. So if you put an apple on your desk while you're interviewing them, if you're the doctor, they eat the apple. If you put glasses on the desk, they put on the glasses. Sometimes they have as many as 4 pairs of glasses on by the end of a session with the doctor. I mean, the examples are wonderful. If a streetcar goes by, they take it, whichever, never mind where it's going. It affords jumping on. And my favorite example is, it's sort of sexist, but it isn't, I didn't make it up, it's just the way the world goes. If they had a man who was a patient like this, and they took him into the room where there was an unmade open bed, and he got undressed and went to bed, because that's what beds afford. And they took then separately, they had a woman patient and took her into this room, and she immediately started making the bed. So you can see that different people see different affordances depending on the culture that conditioned them. Anyway, that's pure responding to affordances. That's clearly not what we do. And Schneider's clearly got something wrong with him, even when he's described like a Homeric hero, just in there doing the wallet. And so on the other extreme, I haven't found an example. There would be, I'm sure, some kind of pathology of pure abstract attitude, in which somebody would have a completely detached view of themselves and everybody else sort of from nowhere. I mean, they can't quite achieve God's point of view, but they would be constantly in a kind of detached theoretical relation to things. Maybe there can't be any such person, because, or at least they'd have to be hospitalized, because they wouldn't be doing anything. Nothing would attract them to do. Well, no, they would be, when they did anything, they'd do it because they figured out that this was the time, for instance, to eat, and that you eat by putting the food on the fork and putting the fork in your mouth. Maybe there are such pathologies. If anybody knows, let me know. Yeah.
Ponty describes something where people have damage to the emotional parts of their brain, and they're unable to act on kind of the effective coloring of the world. They literally have to decide consciously to do anything, and therefore, often, because they can't set goals, can perceive affordances, they don't do anything.
Okay.
They have an incredible amount of time doing it. It's very difficult for them to do it.
So that's good. Well, they would be going out toward the pure abstract attitude. I'm setting this up so that later you can see why Merleau-Ponty is going to want to refute this. He's going to want to say, in effect, these two attitudes are very weird, extreme things, attitudes. They're not our normal attitudes, and moreover, you can't get how would you get your normal attitude just by sort of bumping these two extremes together, which is what all the Gail Goldstein can do, since they don't have an underlying thing called being in the world, of which these could be sort of degrees of going toward abstract or going toward involvement. And that's the basic idea from his point of view. You can't get sort of pure receptivity where you're just responding like the utilization behavior to whatever goes along, together with pure spontaneity, whereas a free agent, you're choosing what to do and how. You can't get those two things together in any understandable way to explain the thing we've got, namely not just responding to each affordance which pulls us in completely, and not standing outside and having to make up our minds about whether anything is worth pursuing at all. You can't get those, if those are the only two possibilities you've got, pure receptivity and pure spontaneity, you're never going to get what we've got. And that's the direction he's going during those 18 pages, where he's telling you a lot of interesting, crazy things that Schneider can do and can't do. Albert, did you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to just call attention to two things. One is that he doesn't ever talk about concrete or abstract attitude. He seems to always talk about concrete or abstract movement.
Huh.
And I don't know whether that's significant. That was the first comment. I haven't seen it. Sorry, I haven't seen it.
I see.
And the second thing I want to say is that there seem to be three different kinds of behavior contrasted in this chapter. One is what you might call sort of engaged in being in the world behavior. The other is sort of pretend behavior, like, oh, salute to me, and then you just salute, even though you're not in a situation where you would normally salute, but you're just saluting.
But you can't do that. Schneider can't do that, but we can do that.
And then the third is where you do something by mechanically looking at your body and analyzing how to do it and performing the intellectual acts to guide the movement. So there seem to be three, and I'm not sure which is...
Well, let me go through them again and see if there are really three. Let's do the saluting one. Schneider can salute if he is in the concrete situation in which a salute is required, and he can even do it if he can imagine himself into the concrete situation. So if he thinks if he gets into a posture of standing up straight, and he thinks presumably the doctor as a general or something, and if he gets far enough in that, he can just salute, because he gets himself into the situation in which that's the situation requires that of him, and it just happens. But if he doesn't do that, he has to do this other weird thing of doing this meaningless movement in which he has to find his hand by wiggling his body around till he finds his hand moving, and then watching it, get it up to his head, and so forth. And that's trying to salute with an abstract attitude. So I don't think whether it's attitude or movement makes any difference, but if it does, I've always thought that, in fact, I would have thought their book is in terms of abstract and concrete attitude. But anyway, for the time being, unless I discover it makes a difference, I'm just going to go on talking the way I think about it. Now, but now what's the third? The third is, if I tell you to salute, even though there's no war around and no superior officer, you don't have to figure it all out bit by bit, putting the pieces together until you've got a movement called, which looks like a salute. And you don't have to imagine yourself confronting an officer. You can just do it. Why you can just do it is a big deal question. And the answer is supposed to be, roughly, because you've got being in the world. But of course there's a huge gap there, which they're not going to try to fill today. But I don't see any problem about that. There are certainly three things. There's the broken down concrete behavior, which is too concrete, the broken down abstract behavior, which is too abstract, and what we do.
On your page 127, I think,
okay,
he writes that if I then executed the same movement, but without having any present or even imaginary partner in mind, and treat it as a set of movements in themselves, and then he goes on to describe a sort of robotic movement.
Yeah, that's like the abstract one. Yeah, that's what Schneider does.
So then the movement, the pretend movement, when you have an imaginary person, or the movement when the person is actually present, those are both instances of concrete, then?
No.
Because he's definitely making kind of three-way contrast here.
I don't get it yet.
So if I make the same movement...
Where are you?
Well, according to the concordance, it's probably around 127.
The bottom of 127.
Bottom, okay, let me just see it.
If I then execute...
the same movement, but I'm not any present or even imaginary partner, and treat as a set of movements in themselves, that is right funny. Okay, that bottom thing is Schneider's abstract attitude or abstract movement.
Which bottom thing?
The one where you make a set of movements and you get your upper arm and your lower arm and you finally get your whole arm up there towards the face.
But I thought his thing is that he concretizes.
He can do either. The way I understand it, Schneider has two options when you tell him to salute. He either imagines himself completely into a situation in which it's just inevitable that he'll salute because there's the superior officer in front of him and so forth, or he can do it in an abstract way, but then he has to find his hand, find his arm, keep his eye on it, and move it up to where it's in the proper relation to his forehead. He can do both those things. The one thing he can't do is perform a straightforward, simple salute in a situation in which but we're not in the army and there's no officer around. We can do that. I can just stand right up in front of you and salute, maybe. I've never tried it. I'm not going to try it now. It might not work. So in any case, those are the three possibilities. And Schneider's got two of them. And what's peculiar from Merleau-Ponty's point of view, as I understand it, trying to keep my head above water, you've got to keep from sinking into this or you just lose your wits, is what's interesting from Merleau-Ponty's point of view is how the concrete one and the abstract one are both pathological. And the idea that somehow you could put them together to get the normal one is just completely misguided. But that seems to be what Gelb and Goldstein think that you should do. Yeah.
The two salute cases you were just describing, is one of those supposed to be concrete, or is there an abstract and then a breakdown of the abstract?
No, one of them is concrete. I mean, I meant, I hope this is still right. The concrete one is you imagine yourself into a situation so concrete that you just can't help actually saluting. The abstract one is you stand outside of it all, but you turn your body into an object and you find out where your hand is and you find out where your arm is.
That's a breakdown of the abstract. I mean, the abstract is what we can do that Schneider can't, right?
Well, this is so hard because both of them are similar to something we can do. I mean, what the Homeric heroes could do, just letting their arm go out to the food in front of them, and that wasn't pathological. And we can describe it. When we salute, that's something we can do in this middle way. But you could do something that wasn't pathological but was abstract if I asked you to perform some movement that you're not used to and so forth. And it needn't be pathological, I think. But the trouble is that we don't do that much of either of these things because they're not normal, and Schneider has only those two things.
I'm just wondering if there's three categories of movement here or two categories and breakdown cases of each category.
Okay, now I see the point. I think, now again, oh boy, that's because you got to ask it from Gelb Goldstein's perspective and from Merleau-Ponty's. From Gelb Goldstein's perspective, there are two kinds of movement, and each of them is, well, I don't know yet, and they seem to be pathological in Schneider's case. No, I'm not sure. No, maybe not. Okay, I guess I'm just going to figure this out. There are two kinds of movement. One of them is you respond to the affordance of the concrete situation. Schneider can do that, and we do that. And it's only pathological if what? If you are locked into the situation in something like utilization behavior. Schneider is more like an animal. An animal can only respond when it's hungry, their food, it just has to eat it. And Schneider has that. And now what would keep it from being pathological that way? Well, you sprinkle in a little abstraction, is the way I think Gelb and Goldstein think about it. I mean, it's only pathological when it totally lacks the ability to not respond to the situation or move from situation to situation. Where would it get that? It needs a lot of abstract stuff put in. Then it can move from situation to situation and not get pulled into the situation. And now comes more a hard question that you're asking there. And what is this abstract thing when it's by itself? Well, I think the answer would be, it would be this weird thing of having to find out sort of what your goal was, where your body was, and how to get from one to the other. Why don't we normally do that? We don't do that because we've always got a lot of the involved parts sprinkled in. And so our normal way of reacting, this third way, is a mixture of the abstract way and the concrete way. I think that's how Goldstein understands it. And Merleau-Ponty thinks that's a big step ahead of everybody else and hopeless at the same time. Yeah.
I don't know whether this will help, but on the same page I read from before, he writes, concrete concrete movement occurs in the realm of being or of the actual. The latter, that is to say, abstract movement, occurs, I'm sorry, I lost it. Okay, the first adheres to a given background, concrete adheres to a given background, abstract throws out its own background. And he says that same thing in a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
So imaginary behavior, like waving to a non-existent friend, is abstract behavior. Because you're making up your own background, but relative to that made-up background, you're engaged with the background, with the world.
Well, I see what you're saying. That is a funny case about Schneider. He can, I guess it's going to turn out to be important. The details are so complicated. I don't think Schneider can just make up a situation of being in the military and having to salute. He has to stand erect, and he has to get himself in the feeling that he is actually in that situation. Of course, he is imagining it. That's what you're adding. But he's not imagining it in a way that you and I could imagine it, as a situation that we're not really in, but we might be in. He somehow has to imagine it so concretely that he's in it. And he can do that. I don't know why he can do that or how he can do that, but that's the picture. It's not our kind of imagining it, I think. You wouldn't, if you can't, I mean, you're not going to imagine it in such a way that your arm just automatically goes up in this sort of mechanical way that you would if you were in the Army, but he does it that way. Yeah.
How does Schneider learn computers in the first place? Is the psychic blindness there from birth?
Oh no, that's very clear. Have you read it? I mean, it says he got a shell in the back of his head in the First World War. That's what's wrong with him. A big piece of his brain is missing. But he was normal. And you're absolutely right, I think, and a very interesting question you're asking. I think they answer it, but I can't remember. But the question would be, can he learn new skills now? Would be related to your thing. And the answer is, I believe he can't. I think it's sort of implicit in here that he can make his wallets because he already knew how to do that, and he can walk home and greet his wife because he already knew how to do that. But you can't sort of, I don't think, teach him, say, ping pong at this point. That's one thing I want to say about it. Let me see, there was two things in respect to that. Just a second. What's the other? This speculation I'm going to get to at the end of the lecture, because I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's very intriguing, but a lot of stuff has to be put in place. Let me go through this for a while. We're jumping around, which is my fault. I always want to give you the whole picture before I jump into the details. So we get a whole list on, let's go back to my 103, which is the first page of the chapter.
You mean 113?
No, sorry. I say 103, but I don't mean 103. You're right. Oh, it's your page 103. I've got the two pages in here. I don't know what it is in mine.
First page of Schneider?
Yeah, the first page of Schneider. Well, it starts listing a whole lot of things Schneider can do.
118
maybe?
It's 103 in my book, so it's 118 or 118.
I see. Having two books is really, as if there wasn't enough trouble in understanding this. Having two books to go back and forth between is really maddening. But that's it. That's just, it's 118, of course, where you get a whole list of the stuff he can do and can't do. And I don't know whether, I think we maybe don't have to read it. He's unable to perform abstract movements. He can only do them if he can watch his limbs while he does them. But, yeah, we just got to get this nice contrast. But he's got this normal, or seemingly normal, response into the concrete issues. Even when his eyes are closed, the patient performs. We're in the middle of 118 for the book we're reading. The patient performs with extraordinary speed and precision the movements needed in living his life, provided that he's in the habit of performing them. He takes his handkerchief from his pocket, blows his nose, takes his match out of the box and lights the lamp, and he makes his wallets like almost as well as a normal workman. And so there is a little further a dissociation of the act of pointing from reactions of taking and grasping. And of course, the famous paper, which we view in the background of what we're reading and what gets mentioned every once in a while, is Zeigen and Greifen. It's pointing and grasping. The amazing thing about Schneider is he can grasp his nose with no problem at all. and when he blows his nose or when a mosquito lands on his nose, but he can't point to his nose. And Merleau-Ponty, well, Gail Goldstein and Merleau-Ponty are asking the question, what in the world kind of situation is that? And the answer seems to be, he's got the concrete attitude, which enables him to just simply be involved in the situation and do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time in the appropriate way with skill. But he hasn't got the abstract attitude, which is to sort of stand back and sort of look at himself from a distance and just point at his nose, even though there's no reason. Another example, by the way, I think is interesting, which will come up in a minute. Remember, he can go to the door and go out if you tell him to, but he can't go just up to the door and then stop. And why? Because if you're performing a concrete movement, it's, remember, magically at its end. He can only start to go through the door and go out because he starts to go through the door to go out from the moment he starts going, and his hand and his body are all set up like that. And he can do it because he's already pictured or already set to go out. But if you ask him just to go as if you were going to go out the door but stop at the last minute, then he hasn't got the goal magically already ahead of him to organize his behavior, and he can't do it. In other words, only if he's involved in going out the door can he just go out the door. If you ask him to go up to the door but then just stop a little bit before, that's an abstract movement. Then he has to view his movement not as just letting the goal grab him and pull him to where he wants to go, but he has to know where he is at every moment and know where he is when he gets to the door and stops. He can't do that. Sort of neat. And the hour will get there. Why do I keep getting ahead? There's a lot that he can't do. He can't stand back and deal with the objective world. That's what we've just seen. But he can respond to affordances. That's what we've just seen when he blows his nose and so forth. He can grasp but not point. That's where I just was talking at the bottom of 118. And the question is, how can he not know where his nose is when it comes to pointing at it and know where it is when it comes to grasping it? And that's because, they say on 119, there's got to be two different kinds of space that he's in. There's the spatiality of coping and the spatiality of observing, in effect. That you've got to conclude, he says, that grasping and touching are different from pointing. But he then has this great question about 8 lines down on 119. If I know where my nose is when it's a question of holding it, how can I not know where it is when it's a matter of pointing at it? And then he says, well, then only because there are these two kinds of space, the conscious representational kind, and giving a determinate place to something in the determinate objective world. We're in the middle of 119, and he can't do that. Let's see, where are we? Because such a representation either is or is not, and if it is, he uses the object unambiguously and so forth. All that's exactly what normal, abstract, detached consciousness can do. But now there has to be another kind of space given to me in an intention to take hold without being given an intention to know. The patient is conscious of his body space in the matrix of habitual action, but not in objective setting. And that's all just ways of describing, in traditional philosophical terms, what's going on with him. Except that it's what's going on with him is the peculiar dissociation of the sort of Cartesian objective world and objective space from the existential, involved, coping world, the coping space. For us, they're together in a way that never really gets clear. Okay, yeah.
Just very quickly, this is one of the best cases to support the interpretation you were making last time as against me.
Really?
Because from my point of view, you wouldn't think pointing at something and grasping at it would be any different if it's in terms of a kind of abstract body-centered, egocentric space.
That's
But
interesting.
if somehow an actual grappling with the local properties of the thing out there make a difference to my comprehension of the space, that would seem
That's
to me
interesting.
to be
Yes,
your interpretation.
that would be. I guess he would, and he is sort of, I guess, implicitly using it to make something like that point, but I never saw it. Yeah, let me just repeat it, or you repeat it, because it's interesting. Let me try to repeat it. If what we know when we live in and understand space is the way our motions are correlated with what? Let me see. Action. Where what we see is correlated with what we do when we move, and we have the whole. If the body schema were an understanding of all of what Alva calls in his papers the sensory motor contingencies, that is how a certain action will bring about a certain experience, then if that's what it is to understand sort of perception and action, then it ought to be the case that you couldn't separate, the way Schneider has, a sense of the relation, an abstract sense of the relation of action, of perception and action, from an involved sense of perception and action. They would be the same kind of, there would be one understanding, and it would be, you would have your body would know all the sensory motor contingencies, and the idea that you could know them in one respect. How does it go here? That you could know them in a way objectively without knowing them involvedly seems maybe missing from that. That's good. That's very interesting. Yeah.
It seems like this whole Schneider case is supposed to really implode the contrast between intellectualism and empiricism, that somehow both sides are doomed to failure. And so I was just hoping you could articulate. I feel like this might be one of those passages where, maybe empiricists can explain the concrete motion with like a reflex theory or just kind of dissociation, and the intellectualists can explain would try to explain abstract motion, but neither side could explain the other. And therefore, neither side can explain Schneider, given his peculiar.
Well, I have to think about that. That's an interesting proposal. Let me see.
I'm not sure what exactly the argument is, but I feel like throughout this section, he really wants to use Schneider as a way of showing exactly how empiricism and intellectualism must fail. And that what seems to be interesting about Gelb and Goldstein is that they want a kind of hybrid view of intellectualism and empiricism.
Yeah, I think that's intriguing, what you're saying. You hear him back there? Okay. I don't know what to think about it, just only for the following reason. That Gelb Goldstein, being enough of gestaltists, have certainly the idea of responding to affordances. It's not strictly mechanical what he does when he blows his nose or makes his wallet.
Right, not Gelb and Goldstein.
Right. So,
but we can imagine the empiricist approach towards concrete movement.
Yeah.
They would be very happy with trying to account for concrete movement.
That's right. But it isn't as if he thinks that, Merleau-Ponty thinks that the Gelb-Goldstein distinction between concrete and abstract movement is the same as the distinction between what the empiricist can explain and what the intellectualist can explain, though it's close. That's why I'm worrying about it.
Well, I guess here's one way of putting it. There's an empiricist sense in which I understand where my nose is, in the sense I can swat it, But then there's also an intellectualist sense in which I understand or know where my nose is, and so I should be able to point to it.
That's right.
But starting from one understanding of what my nose is, you can't account for the dissociation in Schneider.
Okay.
Being able to swat,
that's good.
not being able to point.
Yeah, I guess that's good. I mean, that says that there's a challenge to the empiricist to explain how we can point at our nose, and a challenge to the intellectualist to explain how we can manage to hit our nose or blow our nose even when we can't point to it. I think that's right. I'm just trying to figure out how much of the concrete attitude, as Del Goldstein wanted to introduce it, the empiricist can understand, and that's a different
Right.
question.
Well, yeah. So I want to distinguish three positions.
Okay.
The empiricist position, which is going to be doomed to failure somehow,
All right.
according to Merleau.
Right.
The intellectualist, which is somehow doomed to failure.
Mm-hmm.
And then what Gelb and Goldstein are going to try to fuse the two.
And that's doomed to failure,
And that's
too.
doomed to failure.
Yes. Okay. That's right. Let's go back to this. Bear that in mind. The more you can use the intellectualist empiricist sort of framework as a guide, the better. So there's the objective body in Cartesian space, and we talked about that. And then there's the body which is not in Cartesian space, where I have this sense of where my body is, so that I can swat a mosquito anywhere on my body without having to figure out where the mosquito is and where my hand is, and bringing them together in objective space. And I think that's what I want to say about that for a minute. I see where he can't. This is where he on 119 at the top is where if you tell him that he can't arrive at his goal, he can't even start. This is where is it? From the outset, about 4 lines down. From the outset, the grasping movement is magically to completion. This is again what you keep hearing. It can begin only by anticipating its end, since to disallow taking hold is sufficient to inhibit the action. That is, if you can't go all the way and knock on the door or turn the doorknob, then you can't even start. If all you had was the concrete kind of movement, of course we can do it. We can go to the door and stop on a command, because we aren't limited to doing only the way that we are related to the door when we're responding to the affordance of the door and letting it draw the action out of us. We do that, but we don't have to do that, whereas Schneider can only do that. Okay, this is the same point, but we have to say it over and over. So where are we? There's 2 different ways to move the body. I can move it as an object. With some difficulty, I can represent my objective body and represent the objective success conditions, whatever it is I'm trying to do, and then bring them together and do it. This is what happens on 120, where he talks about if he isn't in the situation, then what happens is this very objective kind of thing. For Schneider, about 15 lines, the patient must first of all find his arm, find the gesture called for, and so forth and so forth. We don't need to do that. Because what? Because we are always in, or we can be in this practical situation. And he can do it if he's in a practical situation. What he can't do is do this objective thing of imagining easily how to do something without arriving at a goal and do something he isn't in the right situation to do. He has to do that with pure abstract motion, which is this awkward thing of trying to find himself in objective space and move to where he's going. Yeah.
Can Schneider point to the door?
No, I think not. I mean, it would follow not, as far as I can see. He can go to the door and go out of it. But can he point to? I don't think so. But partly the problem with Schneider is he's practically blind. You read later on if you've gone that far. That's the trouble. I mean, he's lost so much of his brain that it's not clear just what these different deficits mean. Maybe he can't even see the door, except as a kind of blob. But I think that if he were a pure case of total involved concrete movement with no abstract movement, he couldn't point at the door. Keep your eyes open to see if there's any evidence for this. I don't remember any place where he talks about it. It wouldn't be so dramatic, you see. I mean, if he can't, and it seems like if he can grasp his nose and can't point at it, then why should he be able to point at the door? If he could go grasp the door, he shouldn't point at it. So and that's probably what you wanted to hear.
That's exactly it.
Okay, I'm with you. I think that's right. Okay, so then I can make these concrete movements in which I respond to the affordances in the world. That's the other way. Then I don't have to find my arm. I just do it, responding at the top of 120, either to the actual situation or imagining yourself in the actual situation is all he needs. Then he can do it. 121. Now this is where you can swat the mosquito that stings him in the middle of 121. And that's so interesting to me because Merleau-Ponty says there, he finds straight away where the mosquito is and slaps it. Because for him there's no question of locating it, the bite place, in the coordinates of objective space, but of reaching with his phenomenal hand a certain painful spot on his phenomenal body. The whole operation, skipping a little, takes place in the domain of the phenomenal. It does not run through the objective world. I read that to you because, I've been reading Merleau-Ponty for years, getting glimmers of why it's interesting and plausible and important. This was really important to me when I was at MIT. And I thought, gee, that's interesting because they have a robot arm and it's connected to a camera. And the camera shows the robot arm where something is. You train the camera on something, and then a lot of computing is supposed to go on, and the robot arm is supposed to go over and reach it or pick it up. And I thought, gee, that's exactly like the not having the concrete attitude. That would mean that would be like swatting the mosquito bite by figuring out where in objective space the pain was on your arm or the mosquito, and where in objective space your hand was, and then doing an immense calculation with all the degrees of freedom in your shoulder, in your elbow, in your wrist, in your hand, and finally figure out how to get your hand from here over to here. That would be very hard. So I said, I don't think they're ever going to be able to do their robot project. And they didn't. They never could solve those huge amount of simultaneous equations that would be needed to move the arm in objective space to an object that it had seen that the camera had seen in objective space. There are now ways to do it using neural networks, but that's all right. They don't solve the problem in objective space. But Merleau-Ponty sort of turned me on to that in the fact that you could see that the body. Our way of doing it is not finding ourselves in physical space. Okay, let me go on here. Okay, here's the stuff on 122, which we read already, I think. Yes, where for him, he just sits at his desk, and the scissors and the leather and everything just pull him in and elicit necessary movements from him. I'm reading that. And the typical Gestalt thing, he wanted to get his motor reactions established the most effective balance between all these actions. That's the maximum grip talk, again, in kind of minimal form. And he can do that. By the way, now, I just noted, for those who've had Searle, there's something interesting going on here. There's the question when your mind decides to do something, has a goal, it makes an intentional movement. Is it moving your phenomenal body, or is it moving your body in objective space? That may have worried you. It worries him. If you look at the bottom of 121, it's not a question of how the soul, that's just the mind, acts on the objective body, since it's not on the ladder that it acts, but on the phenomenal body. So the question has to be reframed. So when the intention to act reaches down and governs the bodily movement, is it the phenomenal bodily movement, or is it the bodily movement in Cartesian space? I think that's a problem. That's what I think. And he thinks that's a big problem. And somehow he thinks the answer to this problem, there's a sort of paper topic in here if you've had Searle. Yeah, and does the answer to this problem, how do you answer it? By saying, well, you're not moving your arm in objective space, you're moving your phenomenal arm in phenomenal space. Is that an answer that Searle could accept? Is that a devastating criticism?
He wouldn't accept that.
He wouldn't accept that, any more than he thinks that your pain is in your foot, when he thinks your pain is in your brain. Okay, the same problem is there. And so is the footnote. I remember I said I would tell you the footnote where he's talking about reaching down and governing in a way that is exactly like a criticism of Searle. This is only, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I know it's only interests some of you, but it definitely ought to interest some of you. Where are we? Okay, 138 in ours and 139. Whoop. 138 and 139 in this one. Give us a concordance. It's 138, 139 in yours.
Then it is 160, 161.
Okay, 160, 161. It is? No? We're having a problem. Where are we?
Sorry.
Now,
In my book, in the old one, it's one.
yeah. Anyway, I found it. I don't know what the right story is. It's in, maybe I said something wrong somewhere. 138, 139 in the old book is what I want. And that, now what? Tell me where that is in the new book.
Well, 159 and 160.
Okay, let's try that. 159. Yes, that's right. And that's all about how the representation of the movement can cause the movement. That's 2 footnotes on that subject. And he seems to be really exactly worrying about something like, anyway, Searle's position on this, I think. And he says it arises because of a dualism of consciousness and objective body. And then there's going to be a problem of how consciousness moves the objective body. And he says that it's a magical process at the end of the footnote on your footnote on 160. And this is where magical is a kind of insult and not a placeholder for science. We still need to understand by what magical process the representation of a movement causes precisely that movement to be made by the body. The problem can only be solved provided we cease to draw a distinction between the body as a mechanism in itself and consciousness as a being for itself. That seems serious. Okay, so now back to where we were, which is I had fun trying to just explain the fact that when he's talking about Schneider, it makes his experiences sound very strange. We're back on 122. But it isn't as if we're not like Schneider some of the time. In fact, we're sometimes like, I think we're like Schneider when we're sometimes at our best. And I just want to remind you, besides the Homer talk of the warrior's arm going out to the food in front of them, which sounds just like 122, that is elicited to make the necessary movement by the whole system of what's there, you can have it again in the example I used in some paper I wrote in a tennis game. If you're involved in the game and if you have the skill and so forth, then the other person and the way they're moving and the sound of the ball that was hit and the way the ball seems to be moving will just pull you to a part of the court and your arm to how much the racket's going to be slanted and so forth. Your body schema is going to do all that. You couldn't do that. You couldn't figure out where to run and least of all know how much to turn your racket and how fast to move it. All of that gets figured out by the body schema, and you just have to do the necessary movements are just elicited from you by the whole gestalt of the tennis game. In fact, the tennis game, I thought I'd made it up as an example, but he has it in the structure of behavior as an example. Just what I just said, how the gestalt of, if you have the skill, the gestalt of the whole court and everything will make your body do what needs to be done. And I just want to say all that because it isn't as if we don't behave like Schneider. And another one I wanted to mention that just the bottom of 121, I'm still explaining this. It's never our objective body that we move, but our phenomenal body. And there is no mystery in that, since our body has the potentiality for this or that part of the world, surges towards objects, the objects to be grasped, and perceives them. That's right. And I wanted to say, and interestingly enough, if there isn't an object there, sometimes we can't make the movement. I mean, I was trying to think of an example where we are totally like Schneider, where we would have to figure out abstractly how to do something, which as long as we're in the situation, we can do perfectly easily. And there's a famous example of that. I didn't make this up. Ask yourself, how do you type the letter E on a touch keyboard? Which finger do you use? And so forth. Well, if you're like me, you have no idea that if you sit down at the keyboard, the right finger will go to the right key. And it isn't even enough to try to imagine it. And some people, I think, they say they can. They can solve this problem and say, oh, I understand. I'll imagine I'm typing the word T-H-E and I'll find out which finger types the E. I can't do it. I don't know if some of you can probably and some of you can't. But if you're Schneider enough like, and I guess I am, the only way to do it, to be able to type the letter E is to be actually in front of a keyboard. Even imagining. Certainly you can't do it without imagining the keyboard. That's already like Schneider. And I think you're even more like Schneider, perhaps. If you can't, maybe I should give you a harder letter like Z. Just by sheer imagining that you're typing zebra, see if you can figure out which finger types the Z. I just want you to have a sense of it, that's what it's like to be Schneider all the time.
Or when you asked me that, I could feel his fingers.
Twitching.
Yeah.
Was that the Z fingers? Oh, well, you guys got helpful hands. But it's in your hands. I like that example. In fact, I want to put on reserve. This is another parenthetical, but time is almost up. I better save it. I'm going to put on reserve a book called Ways of the Hand by a guy named Sudnow, who taught himself to be a jazz pianist and describes in excruciating detail for a whole book the stages he went through. But what's interesting is at the end of it, where he talks about how his hands now know jazz. He can't reach for the right notes. It's the typewriter thing again. But his hands can reach for the notes. And that's to get you out of the thing thinking about it's the body, my body. The title of the book, Ways of the Hand, is exactly right. It's not sort of Ways of my hand, having learned. David Sudnow is out of it. Is when he's doing his jazz right, it's in his hands. And that's like the typing thing. There's nothing special to look up if you need to look at this book, but if you look at the last part of the book, you'll just see somebody sort of sensitively describing this phenomenon, which anybody will have when they acquire any skill, that their body will finally take over and do it.